They said justice was blind, but Margaret O'Sullivan froze mid-step at the courthouse entrance, her hand gripping the iron rail as she realized justice in Redemption Valley had dollar signs for eyes. The marriage certificate in Captain Thunder Morrison's weathered hand wasn't a rescue. It was a declaration of war. The courtroom erupted like a disturbed hornet's nest. Judge Blackwood's gavel cracked against his bench with the sharp report of a pistol shot. Women gasped behind lace fans. Men lurched to their feet, chairs scraping against floorboards like fingernails on coffin wood. Margaret's amber eyes searched the crowd that had gathered to watch her hang, recognizing faces she'd served tea to, swept floors for, smiled at during 18 months of marriage to William Hartford. Now, those same neighbors turned away, their silence heavier than any accusation. Every soul in this courtroom needs to hear the truth. Thunder's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Who was this stranger claiming her as his wife? And why did his steel blue eyes hold secrets that could either save her life or seal her fate forever? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan had learned early that hope was a dangerous luxury she couldn't afford. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads. Auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, emerald eyes that once sparkled with dreams, and a spirit that had been systematically broken over 18 months of marriage to William Hartford. Now, sitting alone at the defendant's table in Redemption Valley's courthouse, she kept those eyes fixed on her folded hands, refusing to meet the hostile stares of the townspeople who had gathered to watch her hang. She had arrived in Texas 7 years ago as a 17-year-old Irish immigrant, orphaned and desperate, with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a letter of introduction to distant cousins who turned out not to exist. Redemption Valley was supposed to be her fresh start, a place where hard work and determination could overcome poverty and circumstance. Instead, it became her prison. William Hartford was the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, a man whose charm in public was matched only by his cruelty in private. When he offered marriage to the destitute Irish girl, the town saw Christian charity. What they didn't see were the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the flinch that had become second nature whenever heavy footsteps approached, or the way she had learned to make herself invisible in her own home. The marriage had been arranged through Judge Harrison Blackwood, Hartford's longtime business partner, and the most powerful man in the county after Hartford himself. At 58, Blackwood commanded respect through a combination of legal authority and ruthless ambition. What the townspeople didn't know was that their esteemed judge had built his fortune through a network of illegal land acquisitions, forged documents, and strategic murders disguised as accidents or natural causes. Dr. Benjamin Wright sat in the gallery, avoiding Maggie's gaze with the practiced ease of a man who had perfected the art of looking away. He had treated her injuries more times than he cared to remember, broken ribs, split lips, bruises in the shape of handprints, but had never asked questions and never filed reports. The money Hartford paid for his silence had put his own children through school and bought his wife's fine dresses. Mrs. Catherine Mills, the boarding house owner, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had witnessed Hartford dragging Maggie by her hair across Main Street after church one Sunday, had seen the terror in the young woman's eyes, but had convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere between husband and wife. The shame of that moment still burned in her chest. Father Michael O'Brien clutched his rosary beads, remembering the times Hartford had confessed his difficulties controlling his temper with his wife, always followed by generous donations to the church. The priest had offered counseling, but Hartford's confessions had grown darker over time, speaking of his wife as a burden he longed to be free of permanently. 50 miles north, Captain Samuel Thunder Morrison was breaking camp with his crew, preparing for what should have been a routine cattle drive to Kansas. At 32, he had earned his nickname during the legendary storm drive of 1882, when he had led 500 head of cattle and 20 cowboys through 3 days of lightning and torrential rain without losing a single animal or man. The morning of June 10, 1885, began like every other morning in the Hartford mansion, with the sound of Maggie's bare feet on cold wooden floors as she prepared her husband's breakfast in the pre-dawn darkness. The routine had become as natural as breathing. Eggs over easy, thick-cut bacon, black coffee with 2 sugars, and a bowl of porridge sweetened with honey. She moved through the kitchen with practiced silence, her movements efficient and careful, knowing that any sound loud enough to wake William prematurely would result in a painful reminder of her place in his household. The bruises on her wrists had faded to a sickly yellow-green, remnants of his grip from 3 nights earlier when she had dared to ask if she might visit the church social. The question had sent him into one of his rages, and she had learned once again that her world extended no further than the walls of his house unless he decreed otherwise. She pulled her sleeves down to cover the marks and continued her work, her thoughts carefully blank. At precisely 7 o'clock, she carried the breakfast tray to William's study, where he conducted what he called his business affairs. Meetings with desperate farmers who needed loans, negotiations with Mexican families who suddenly found their land deeds questioned, and correspondence with Judge Blackwood about their various enterprises. The study smelled of cigar smoke, whiskey, and something else she couldn't quite identify, a medicinal odor that had grown stronger over the past months. William sat behind his massive oak desk, already dressed despite the early hour, his face bearing the gray pallor that had become increasingly common. At 45, he was still a handsome man by most accounts, with thick dark hair only beginning to show silver at the temples, and the kind of commanding presence that made men step aside when he walked down Main Street. But Maggie had learned to read the subtle signs that others missed, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking, the way he sometimes pressed his palm against his chest as if fighting pain, and most tellingly, the small brown bottle he kept locked in his desk drawer. "Set it there," he commanded, without looking up from his papers, gesturing toward a cleared space on the desk. His voice carried the hoarse quality that had developed over recent months, though he blamed it on the dust and heat rather than acknowledging any weakness. Maggie placed the tray down carefully, noting how his coffee cup rattled slightly against the saucer. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her cold. "I received an interesting letter yesterday," he said, holding up an envelope that made her blood freeze. The familiar handwriting belonged to her sister Bridget in Boston, the only family she had left in the world. "Seems your dear sister is asking for money." Something about her husband being out of work and needing help with the rent. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. She had written to Bridget months ago a carefully worded letter that revealed nothing of her circumstances but had apparently conveyed enough desperation that her sister had responded with an offer of help. The letter must have arrived while William was away on business, and Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper who reported everything to her employer, had obviously delivered it straight to him. "I wasn't expecting any correspondence," Maggie said quietly, though they both knew it was a lie. William's laugh was ugly. "Of course you weren't. Just like you weren't expecting to cost me the Patterson land deal last week when you embarrassed me in front of the entire congregation with that bruise on your face. Do you have any idea how much money your clumsiness cost me?" The Patterson family had owned a small but valuable piece of land adjacent to the railroad right-of-way that William had been trying to acquire for months. When Maggie had appeared at church with a black eye that no amount of powder could completely hide, Mrs. Patterson had made a pointed comment about Christian wives knowing their place, but her husband had quietly withdrawn from negotiations the following Monday. William Hartford's face darkened as he continued to hold Bridget's letter, his knuckles white against the paper. "Maybe it's time I found a new wife," he said, his voice carrying a cold finality that made Maggie's stomach drop. "One who understands the value of discretion and doesn't go around town looking like she's been in a prize fight." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from his ever-present cigars. Maggie knew he wasn't speaking metaphorically. In the past year, 2 other inconvenient wives in neighboring counties had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths attributed to accidents or sudden illnesses that no one questioned too closely. William's connections with Judge Blackwood and the network of corrupt officials throughout the region meant that uncomfortable questions were rarely asked and never pursued. "I understand," Maggie whispered, though her voice came out as barely more than a breath. "Do you?" William leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. "Because I'm beginning to think you're more trouble than you're worth. That Irish temper of yours seems to be showing itself more and more lately." He was referring to the incident at the general store 3 days earlier, when she had instinctively pulled away from his grip in front of Mrs. Patterson and several other ladies. The action had lasted less than a second, but it had been enough to suggest that all was not harmonious in the Hartford household. Such public displays of anything less than perfect marital bliss threatened the carefully constructed image William needed to maintain for his business dealings. "I'll be more careful," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. William stood and walked around the desk to where she stood frozen, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek with a gentleness that somehow felt more threatening than his fists. "You will indeed. Because this morning I'm going to make sure you understand exactly what happens to wives who cause me problems." He moved to his desk drawer, producing a small key from his vest pocket. The lock clicked open, and he withdrew the brown bottle that had become such a fixture in their daily routine. Maggie had long suspected it contained laudanum, the opium-based medicine that many wealthy men use to manage pain and anxiety, though William's dependency had clearly grown beyond medical necessity. "You see this?" He held up the bottle, swirling the dark liquid inside. "This is what keeps me civilized, my dear. Without it, I become quite unmanageable. And lately I've been thinking that perhaps you should have a taste of what I'm capable of when I'm not properly medicated." The implication was clear. Maggie had heard whispers about what happened to his first wife, Sarah Hartford, who had died of a heart condition just 2 years into their marriage. The town doctor had signed the death certificate without question, and William had mourned publicly while privately celebrating his freedom to pursue more profitable matrimonial arrangements. "William, please," she began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "Please what? Please don't give you the same consideration I gave Sarah when she became inconvenient. Please don't arrange for you to have the same sudden illness that took Judge Morrison's wife last month." His smile was cold and predatory. "I'm afraid that decision isn't yours to make anymore." At that moment the study door burst open and Mrs. Hartley rushed in without knocking, a breach of protocol so severe that it could only mean genuine emergency. "Mr. Hartford, sir, there's a man here to see you. Says it's urgent business about the Morrison cattle contract." William's attention shifted immediately to this interruption. The Morrison contract represented thousands of dollars and a crucial step in his plan to control the railroad shipping agreements throughout the county. "What man? I wasn't expecting anyone." "Says his name is Captain Morrison, sir. Thunder Morrison. He's got 2 of his men with him, and they're asking to see the books on that last cattle drive." The color drained from William's face. Thunder Morrison's reputation for absolute honesty was legendary throughout Texas, and if he was asking questions about the cattle contracts, it meant someone had discovered irregularities in the financial arrangements. The Morrison family had been shipping cattle through Hartford's connections for years, but recently William had been skimming profits and blaming losses on Mexican bandits and bad weather. "Tell him I'll be with him in a moment," William said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. He turned back to Maggie, his earlier threats temporarily forgotten in the face of this immediate crisis. You stay here. Don't move. Don't speak to anyone. And if you breathe a word of our conversation to anyone, I'll make sure you follow Sarah Hartford's path to the grave." He strode from the room, leaving Maggie alone with the breakfast tray and the terrible certainty that her time was running out. Through the study window she could see 3 horsemen in the front yard, tall, weathered men with the easy confidence of those who lived honest lives under open skies. One of them, slightly taller than the others, with distinctive silver spurs that caught the morning sunlight, was looking directly at the house with an expression of grim determination. Thunder Morrison had come to Redemption Valley, and somehow Maggie sensed that nothing would ever be the same. Thunder Morrison dismounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. At 32, he possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort, broad shoulders that spoke of years handling unruly cattle, steady gray eyes that missed nothing, and the unhurried movements of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. His reputation had been built on 2 unshakable principles. His word was his bond, and he would ride through hell itself to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The silver spurs that had become his trademark caught the morning light as he approached the Hartford mansion's front porch. They had been a gift from a Mexican rancher whose family Thunder had saved from a flash flood 3 years earlier, and he wore them not as ornament, but as reminder of the moment he had chosen to risk his own life for strangers. That decision had crystallized something in his character, the understanding that a man's true worth was measured not by what he accumulated, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for others. His 2 companions, seasoned cowboys named Jake Peters and Sam Coleman, flanked him with the easy alertness of men who had faced down rustlers, storms, and stampedes together. They had ridden hard from the northern range when word reached them about irregularities in the Hartford cattle contracts, but Thunder's urgency came from something deeper than financial concerns. 3 nights earlier, around a campfire 50 miles north, Thunder had been reviewing the account books when Jake had mentioned seeing William Hartford's wife at the general store in town. "Pretty little thing," Jake had said, "but she moved like a beaten dog, kept her head down, flinched every time someone spoke to her. Reminded me of my sister before her husband finally drank himself to death." The comment had stirred something uncomfortable in Thunder's memory. He had attended the Hartford wedding reception 18 months earlier as a courtesy to a business associate, and even then, something had troubled him about the young Irish woman who had barely spoken above a whisper. She had worn a high-necked dress despite the August heat, and when William had gripped her arm to present her to guests, Thunder had noticed how she bit her lip to keep from crying out. At the time, he had told himself it wasn't his business. William Hartford was a respected member of the community, and interfering in another man's marriage was considered both improper and dangerous. But the memory had festered like an untreated wound, especially after his sister Mary had confided the truth about her own marriage before her death the previous winter. Mary Morrison had died of pneumonia, but in her final days she had revealed the years of abuse she had endured at the hands of her husband, a banker's son whose family connections had made him untouchable. "I kept waiting for someone to notice," she had whispered to Thunder with her dying breath. "Someone to ask the right questions, someone to care enough to look past the pretty lies to the ugly truth underneath." Thunder had buried his sister with a promise that he would never again stand by while an innocent person suffered in silence. That promise had driven him to review the Hartford contracts more carefully, and what he found had shocked him. The financial irregularities were just the beginning. Hartford had been systematically cheating the Morrison family for months, but more disturbing were the cryptic notations in the margins that suggested knowledge of other business arrangements involving Judge Blackwood and several unexplained deaths. Now, standing on Hartford's porch, Thunder felt the familiar weight of his Colt .45 at his hip. Not because he wanted violence, but because experience had taught him that corrupt men rarely surrendered their power willingly. The weapon had saved his life more than once, but it had also become a symbol of the responsibility he carried to use his strength in service of justice rather than personal gain. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing William Hartford himself, his face flushed and his movements slightly unsteady. Up close, Thunder could see the telltale signs of laudanum dependency, the dilated pupils, the slight tremor in his hands, and the sickly sweet odor that clung to his clothing. "Captain Morrison," Hartford said, his voice carrying false warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "What brings you to my humble home so early in the morning?" "Account irregularities," Thunder replied simply, his tone neutral but his gaze steady. "My family's been shipping cattle through your operation for 3 years now, and we've noticed some discrepancies in the payments." Hartford's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure it's just a clerical error. You know how these things can get confused when you're dealing with multiple shipments and seasonal price fluctuations. Why don't we step into my study and sort this out like gentlemen?" Thunder nodded, but his instincts were already on high alert. In his experience, honest men welcomed scrutiny of their books, while those with something to hide tried to control the conversation from the beginning. As they walked through the grand foyer, he noticed the expensive furnishings, the imported wallpaper, and the crystal chandelier that seemed excessive for a ranch house in rural Texas. More importantly, he noticed the silence. Ranch houses should echo with the sounds of daily activity: servants preparing meals, horses being tended in the stable, the general bustle of a working operation. But the Hartford mansion felt muffled, as if the very walls were holding their breath. As they entered the study, Thunder's trained eye immediately cataloged the details: the massive oak desk that served as both workspace and fortress, the locked cabinet that likely held firearms, and the breakfast tray sitting untouched on a side table. The coffee was still steaming, and the eggs remained warm, suggesting that Hartford had been interrupted mid-meal. "Where's your wife this morning?" Thunder asked casually, settling into the chair Hartford indicated while Jake and Sam positioned themselves near the door, a precaution that had become second nature during years of dealing with unpredictable men. Hartford's hand paused almost imperceptibly as he reached for a ledger. "Margaret is indisposed today. Women's ailments, you understand, nothing that concerns us men." The dismissive tone and the careful phrasing sent warning signals through Thunder's consciousness. He had heard similar explanations too many times, convenient excuses that covered bruises, broken bones, and worse. His sister Mary had been indisposed frequently during the worst periods of her marriage. "Perhaps we could say hello when we finish our business," Thunder suggested, watching Hartford's reaction carefully. The Morrison family has always believed in maintaining cordial relationships with all members of our business partners' households. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Hartford replied too quickly. "As I mentioned, she's not feeling well, and I wouldn't want to expose you gentlemen to anything contagious." Thunder exchanged a glance with Jake, who had positioned himself with a clear view of both the main door and the window. His longtime partner's subtle nod confirmed that he, too, sensed something was seriously wrong. "Now then," Hartford continued, opening the ledger with hands that shook slightly, "let's see what we can do about these supposed irregularities." As Hartford began explaining away the missing cattle and altered payment records, Thunder found his attention dividing between the financial deception and his growing concern about Margaret Hartford's absence. The breakfast tray suggested she had been in this room recently, but Hartford's behavior indicated he was desperate to prevent any contact between his wife and his visitors. The ledger itself told a story of systematic theft: cattle counts reduced after delivery, payments delayed and partially skimmed, transportation costs inflated to cover Hartford's personal expenses. But more troubling were the coded references to special arrangements with Judge Blackwood and problem resolution services that seemed to correlate with the suspicious deaths Thunder had been investigating. "These numbers don't match our delivery receipts," Thunder said quietly, producing his own meticulous records from his saddlebag. "According to our count, we delivered 847 head of cattle in April. Your ledger shows 783. Hartford's face flushed deeper, and perspiration began beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "Counting errors happen during large drives, Captain. You know how difficult it can be to maintain accurate tallies when you're dealing with that volume of livestock." "That's why I always use 3 independent counters," Thunder replied evenly. "Jake here, Sam at the gate, and myself doing final verification. We've never had a discrepancy larger than 2 or 3 head on any drive." The tension in the room ratcheted higher as Hartford realized his usual tactics of intimidation and misdirection weren't working. Thunder Morrison's reputation for absolute integrity meant his word carried more weight than ledger entries or financial documents. And Hartford was beginning to understand that he was facing an opponent who couldn't be bought, bullied, or deceived. From somewhere deeper in the house came a faint sound, barely audible, but unmistakably the sound of something heavy falling, followed by what might have been a muffled cry. Thunder's head turned slightly toward the sound, his expression sharpening with concern, while Hartford's face went completely pale. The sound from the back of the house hung in the air like a gunshot, impossible to ignore and loaded with implication. Thunder's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, not drawing but resting his palm against the grip in a gesture that spoke of years spent distinguishing between ordinary household noises and sounds that meant someone was in trouble. "Sounded like something fell," Jake observed from his position by the window, his casual tone belying the alertness in his posture. "Heavy something." Hartford's laugh came out too loud and too forced. "Old house. The floorboards settle, pipes make noise. You gentlemen probably aren't accustomed to the sounds of civilized living, spending so much time on the range." The insult was calculated to provoke a reaction, but Thunder had learned long ago that angry men made poor decisions. Instead, he stood slowly, his gray eyes never leaving Hartford's face. "I'd like to see your wife now, Hartford." "Just to pay my respects." "I told you she's indisposed." "Then we'll be quiet," Thunder interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding men in life-or-death situations. "Won't disturb her rest." Hartford positioned himself between Thunder and the study door, his hand moving toward the desk drawer where Thunder had noticed the outline of what was likely a derringer. "Captain Morrison, I must insist that you respect the privacy of my household. Your business is with me, not with my wife." "My business," Thunder said quietly, "is with anyone in this house who might be in trouble." The words settled between them like a challenge, stripping away the pretense of a routine business meeting. Hartford's mask of civilized hospitality cracked completely, revealing the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. "You're overstepping your bounds," Hartford snarled, abandoning all pretense of courtesy. "This is my property, my family, my business. You have no authority here." "I have the authority of a man with a conscience," Thunder replied, taking a step toward the door. "Something you might have forgotten." Hartford's hand closed around the drawer handle, but before he could open it, another sound echoed from the back of the house, this time unmistakably a woman's voice, weak but audible, calling for help. Thunder moved with the fluid speed of a man whose reflexes had been honed by years of handling spooked cattle in unpredictable weather. He covered the distance to Hartford in 2 strides, his hand clamping down on the other man's wrist before the drawer could open more than an inch. "Jake, Sam," he called without taking his eyes off Hartford, "secure that drawer and watch the door. I'm going to check on Mrs. Hartford." "You can't," Hartford began, but Thunder's grip tightened, and the smaller man's protest died in a sharp intake of breath. "I can and I will," Thunder said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who had made his decision. "The only question is whether you're going to make this harder than it needs to be." Thunder released Hartford's wrist and stepped back, but his stance remained ready for action. Years of reading men and animals had taught him to recognize the moment when flight or fight instincts took over, and Hartford's rapid breathing and darting glances suggested both were being considered. "Mrs. Hartford," Thunder called toward the back of the house, his voice carrying clearly through the mansion's rooms. "This is Captain Morrison. I'm coming to check on you." The response came immediately, a woman's voice, strained but grateful. "Please, I'm in the kitchen." Thunder moved toward the sound, leaving Jake and Sam to watch Hartford. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as he made his way toward the back of the house, his spurs ringing against the hardwood floors with each step. The expensive wallpaper and imported furnishings took on a sinister quality in the morning light filtering through heavy curtains. He found her in the kitchen, slumped against the heavy wooden table where she had apparently been preparing something when she collapsed. Margaret Hartford looked even smaller and more fragile than he remembered from the wedding reception. Her auburn hair had escaped its careful arrangement, her face was pale as morning mist, and her green eyes held the hollow look of someone who had endured more than any human should bear. But it was her condition that made Thunder's blood run cold. She was conscious but clearly struggling, her breathing shallow and labored. On the table beside her sat a cup of tea that she had apparently been drinking, and the bitter almond scent rising from it triggered every alarm in Thunder's experienced mind. "Mrs. Hartford," he said gently, kneeling beside her, but careful not to move too quickly lest he frighten her. "Can you tell me what happened?" "The tea," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said it would help with my headache, but it tasted wrong. Bitter." And then everything started spinning. Thunder's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. The symptoms, the bitter almond smell, the timing. William Hartford had attempted to poison his own wife, and only Thunder's unexpected arrival had interrupted the process before the dose could prove fatal. "How much did you drink?" he asked urgently. Just a sip. Maybe two. It tasted so awful. I stopped." Her eyes fixed on his with desperate hope. "Are you really Captain Morrison? The one they call Thunder?" "Yes, ma'am. And you're going to be fine. We're going to get you help." He could hear raised voices from the front of the house, Hartford arguing with Jake and Sam, demanding they leave his property, threatening legal action and worse. But Thunder's attention remained focused on the woman before him, whose trust and gratitude were already working to counteract what he now recognized as his own years of willful blindness. "Mrs. Hartford," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Has your husband hurt you before?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. For a moment, Thunder thought she might deny it, the reflexive protection of someone who had learned that telling the truth only made things worse. But then her resolve seemed to strengthen, and she nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of 18 months of silence. "Many times." Thunder felt something dark and cold settle in his chest, not the hot anger that led to rash decisions, but the iron determination that had carried him through blizzards and stampedes. Margaret Hartford had just confirmed what he had suspected but never acted upon, and her confession transformed this from a business dispute into something far more serious. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. She nodded and allowed him to help her to her feet, though she swayed slightly and had to grip his arm for support. The poison in her system was still working, but the small amount she had consumed might not prove fatal if they could get her proper medical attention. "We're leaving," Thunder announced, his decision made. "Right now, You're not safe here." From the front of the house came the sound of furniture scraping across floors, and Hartford's voice raised in fury, demanding that his property be returned to him immediately. The word property, applied to a human being who was clearly fighting for her life, sealed William Hartford's fate in Thunder Morrison's mind. Thunder helped Margaret through the mansion's back entrance, supporting her weight as they made their way to where his horse stood waiting. The poison was still affecting her coordination, but her determination to escape seemed to be giving her strength beyond her physical condition. Behind them, the sounds of argument from the study had escalated to outright threats, with Hartford's voice rising to a pitch that suggested complete loss of control. "Jake!" Thunder called as they reached the horses. "We're leaving. Now!" His longtime partner appeared at the front door, backing out slowly while keeping his rifle trained on the study entrance. "Hartford's got himself worked up into quite a state," Jake reported grimly. "Keeps talking about his property rights and how nobody can take what belongs to him." Sam emerged next, his weathered face grim with disgust. "Found some interesting reading material in that desk," he announced, holding up a leather-bound journal. "Seems our friend Hartford's been keeping detailed records of more than just cattle transactions." Thunder settled Margaret onto his horse, wrapping his coat around her shoulders as she shivered despite the morning warmth. The journal would have to wait. Getting her to safety and medical attention took priority over whatever additional evidence of Hartford's crimes Sam had discovered. "What about Dr. Wright?" Margaret asked weakly as Thunder mounted behind her. "He's the only doctor in town, but he—" She trailed off, unable to voice what they all understood, that Dr. Wright's complicity in covering up her injuries made him an unreliable ally. "Doc Martinez in San Felipe," Thunder decided. 20 miles south, but he's honest, and he owes me a favor." As they prepared to ride out, William Hartford burst from the mansion's front door, his face purple with rage and a derringer clutched in his shaking hand. The small pistol looked almost comical in his trembling grip, but Thunder knew that desperate men with weapons were always dangerous, regardless of their accuracy. "You can't take her!" Hartford screamed, raising the weapon toward them. "She's my wife. She belongs to me." Thunder positioned himself between Margaret and the gun, his own Colt .45 appearing in his hand with practiced ease. The difference between the two men was stark. Hartford wild-eyed and unstable, Thunder calm and deadly certain. "Lower the weapon, Hartford," Thunder commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "You've done enough damage for one day." "Damage?" Hartford's laugh was high and hysterical. "I was solving my problems, you interfering bastard. She was going to ruin everything, the Patterson deal, the railroad contracts, my reputation in this community. Do you have any idea what I've built here?" "Built on what?" Thunder asked, his weapon steady despite being mounted on a horse that was growing nervous from the shouting. "Other people's suffering, other people's land, other people's lives." Hartford's response was to fire his derringer wildly in their direction. The shot went wide by several feet, but it accomplished what Thunder had feared. It brought people running from all over town. Within minutes, Sheriff Coleman was approaching at a gallop, followed by several townspeople including Judge Blackwood, Dr. Wright, and Mrs. Mills from the boarding house. The scene that greeted them was damning in its clarity. William Hartford, standing in his front yard with a smoking gun, Thunder Morrison protectively sheltering Hartford's obviously ill wife, and the unmistakable evidence of violence and desperation written across Hartford's face. "What's the meaning of this?" Judge Blackwood demanded. Though his eyes were calculating rather than confused, Thunder realized that Blackwood was already working to assess how this situation could be managed to protect the larger conspiracy. "William Hartford attempted to poison his wife," Thunder announced clearly, his voice carrying to everyone present. "Mrs. Hartford is suffering from the effects of what I believe to be cyanide poisoning administered in her morning tea." Dr. Wright pushed forward, his medical training overriding his complicity in covering up Margaret's previous injuries. One look at her condition confirmed Thunder's diagnosis. The pale complexion, labored breathing, and bitter almond scent were unmistakable symptoms. "She needs immediate treatment," Dr. Wright declared, though his voice carried the guilt of a man who realized he might have prevented this if he had acted earlier. Judge Blackwood, however, was not ready to concede defeat. "These are very serious accusations, Captain Morrison. Are you prepared to prove them in a court of law?" Thunder's smile was cold as winter wind. "I am, Your Honor, starting with the journal Sam found in Hartford's desk, which details not only his systematic theft from my family's cattle operations, but also his business partnership with certain local officials in various illegal land acquisitions." The color drained from Blackwood's face as he realized that Thunder wasn't just rescuing Margaret Hartford. He was unraveling an entire network of corruption that had operated unchallenged for years. Margaret stirred in Thunder's arms, her voice weak but audible to everyone present. "He told me this morning that he was going to make me disappear, just like he did to Sarah Hartford and the others." The admission fell like a thunderclap over the assembled crowd, transforming curious onlookers into witnesses to attempted murder and confession of past crimes. The crowd that had gathered in the Hartford front yard fell silent as Margaret's words sank in. Mrs. Mills pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror as she realized the implications. Sarah Hartford, William's first wife, had died 2 years earlier of what Dr. Wright had certified as heart failure. Now, with Margaret's weak but clear accusation hanging in the morning air, the convenient death took on a far more sinister meaning. Sheriff Coleman, a man more comfortable handling cattle rustlers than complex criminal conspiracies, looked uncertainly between Thunder Morrison and Judge Blackwood. His allegiance had always been to the established power structure of Redemption Valley, but Thunder's reputation for absolute honesty made it impossible to simply dismiss his accusation. "Now see here," Judge Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had served him well for decades. "We can't simply accept wild accusations made by a woman who may be suffering from hysteria or medical distress." "Hysteria?" Thunder's voice cut through Blackwood's protests like a blade. "Judge, Mrs. Hartford is displaying classic symptoms of cyanide poisoning. Dr. Wright, as a medical professional, would you care to examine her and provide your expert opinion?" Dr. Wright approached reluctantly, his hands trembling as he checked Margaret's pulse and observed her breathing. The bitter almond scent was unmistakable, and her symptoms matched perfectly with cyanide toxicity. Years of medical training warred with years of profitable silence as he realized he could no longer avoid the truth. "The symptoms are consistent with poisoning," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. "She needs immediate treatment with activated charcoal and supportive care." "Then let's get her that treatment," Thunder said firmly, preparing to ride toward San Felipe. "Gentlemen, you can continue your discussion after Mrs. Hartford's life is no longer in immediate danger." But William Hartford, his mental state deteriorating rapidly from the combination of laudanum withdrawal and sheer desperation, was far from finished. "You're not taking her anywhere," he screamed, fumbling to reload his Derringer with hands that shook so violently he dropped most of the powder. "She's going to die today, just like I planned, just like they all deserve." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Even Judge Blackwood, for all his corruption and complicity, seemed stunned by Hartford's public admission of multiple murders. Mrs. Mills, who had remained silent during 18 months of observing Margaret's obvious injuries, finally found her voice. "Mr. Hartford," she called out, her voice shaking with emotion, "are you saying you killed your first wife?" Hartford's laugh was the sound of a man whose sanity had finally snapped completely. "Sarah, Sweet, stupid Sarah. She found the ledgers, you see. Started asking questions about the Mexican families and where all their land had gone. Threatened to write letters to Austin about our business arrangements. He gestured wildly toward Judge Blackwood, who had gone ashen-faced. One little bit of foxglove in her evening tea, and suddenly she had a convenient heart condition. Amazing how cooperative doctors become when you pay them enough. Dr. Wright visibly flinched at the accusation, his own complicity in the cover-up written clearly across his features. The crowd began murmuring among themselves, the implications of Hartford's confession spreading through their ranks like wildfire. Thunder felt Margaret sag against him as the poison continued to work through her system, and he made his decision. "Sheriff Coleman," he called out clearly, "I'm placing William Hartford under citizen's arrest for attempted murder, and I'm requesting immediate medical assistance for his victim." "You can't arrest me!" Hartford shrieked, raising his partially loaded Derringer again. "I'm William Hartford. I own this town. I own the judge. I own the sheriff. I own all of you." The admission of owning the judge was perhaps the most damaging of all, confirming what Thunder had long suspected about the corruption that ran through Redemption Valley's power structure. Judge Blackwood's face went from ashen to gray as he realized that Hartford's breakdown was destroying them both. "William," Blackwood hissed urgently, "control yourself. You're saying things that could be misinterpreted." "Misinterpreted?" Hartford turned his wild gaze on his longtime partner. "Harrison, you spineless fool, they already know. Morrison has the journals, the records, everything. Our only choice now is to eliminate the witnesses." The statement sent a chill through the assembled crowd, but it also crystallized something in Thunder's mind. This wasn't just about saving Margaret. This was about exposing a conspiracy that had been murdering innocent people and stealing their property for years. "Sam," Thunder called to his partner, "ride to San Felipe and bring back Doc Martinez. Tell him we have multiple victims of poisoning and possible additional casualties if this situation escalates." "Multiple victims?" Dr. Wright stepped forward, his medical curiosity overriding his fear. "Captain Morrison, are you suggesting there are others?" Thunder's gaze was steady and damning. "Doctor, how many convenient deaths have you certified in the past 2 years? How many sudden heart attacks, mysterious fevers, and accidental poisonings? How many times did the deceased just happen to own property that Judge Blackwood later redistributed to more suitable owners?" The crowd began looking at each other with dawning understanding. Mrs. Patterson whispered urgently to her husband about the Martinez family, whose patriarch had died suddenly just before their ranch was sold at auction for unpaid taxes. Father O'Brien crossed himself as he remembered the Morales family, whose matriarch had succumbed to a mysterious fever the week before their land deed was questioned in court. "This is preposterous," Judge Blackwood declared, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "These are wild accusations based on coincidence and hysteria." But Margaret, despite her weakened condition, managed to speak again. "The bottle," she whispered, pointing toward the house. "In his study, there are others. Different poisons for different circumstances." Thunder felt a cold rage settle in his chest, the kind of controlled fury that had made him legendary among cowboys for his ability to face down stampeding cattle in violent storms. "Sheriff Coleman," he said quietly, "I believe you need to search that study very carefully." Sheriff Coleman, realizing that his position in the community depended on being seen to uphold justice regardless of who was involved, nodded reluctantly. "Jake, Sam, you come with me. Judge Blackwood, I'll need you to witness whatever we find to ensure everything is legal and proper." "I absolutely refuse," Blackwood began, but Thunder interrupted him. "Judge, your refusal to oversee a legal search would be interesting for the newspapers in Austin to report on, especially given what Mrs. Hartford and Mr. Hartford have already revealed about your business relationships. Faced with the choice between participating in the investigation or appearing to obstruct justice, Blackwood had no option but to accompany the sheriff into the house. Hartford, meanwhile, had slumped against his front porch railing, the derringer forgotten in his hand as the full magnitude of his situation began to penetrate his drug-addled consciousness. The search of the study took less than 10 minutes, but the evidence they brought out was damning beyond any possibility of denial. Along with detailed financial records documenting years of theft and fraud, they found a collection of bottles containing various plant-based poisons, each carefully labeled with notes about proper dosage and expected symptoms. Most damning of all was a leather journal containing what could only be described as a murder diary. Detailed accounts of 17 different deaths over the past 3 years, complete with victim profiles, property valuations, and distribution plans for the acquired assets. Dr. Wright, examining the poison collection with horrified fascination, confirmed that the substances were more than adequate to cause the deaths they had attributed to natural causes. Some of these are quite sophisticated, he admitted. Digitalis from foxglove, cyanide from cherry pits, strychnine from nux vomica seeds. Someone has been very thorough in their research. Thunder looked down at Margaret, who had grown alarmingly pale despite the morning warmth. "The evidence can wait," he announced. "This woman is dying while we stand here talking. Sheriff, I'm taking her to get medical attention." "You can arrest whoever needs arresting when I get back." As he prepared to ride out, Margaret stirred in his arms one final time. "Thank you," she whispered so quietly only he could hear. I thought no one would ever—" She didn't finish the sentence before losing consciousness completely. The 20-mile ride to San Felipe became a race against time and Margaret's failing condition. Thunder pushed his horse hard across the rolling Texas hills, one arm supporting Margaret's unconscious form, while the other controlled the reins with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. Behind them, a dust cloud marked the approach of Dr. Martinez, whom Sam had successfully summoned despite the early hour. Dr. Esteban Martinez was everything that Dr. Wright was not: honest, skilled, and utterly incorruptible. The elderly Mexican physician had built his reputation treating everyone from wealthy ranchers to impoverished field workers with equal skill and compassion. His small clinic in San Felipe had become a refuge for those who couldn't afford treatment elsewhere, or who needed medical care without uncomfortable questions being asked. When Thunder thundered into the town square with Margaret's lifeless form in his arms, Dr. Martinez was already waiting with a prepared treatment area and the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too many victims of violence in his long career. One look at Margaret's condition told him everything he needed to know about the urgency of the situation. "Cyanide?" he asked tersely, as Thunder carefully transferred Margaret to the examination table. "Almost certainly. Bitter almond scent, rapid onset, administered in tea approximately 2 hours ago." Dr. Martinez nodded curtly and immediately began treatment, administering activated charcoal to absorb any remaining poison in her system while monitoring her breathing and heart rate. "She is fortunate," he observed as he worked. "The dose was not quite sufficient to kill, and you got her here in time. But it will be touch and go for several hours." As the doctor worked to save Margaret's life, Thunder found himself confronting the full magnitude of what they had uncovered in Redemption Valley. The journal Sam had discovered contained evidence of a systematic campaign of murder and theft that had been operating for years under the protection of corrupt officials. 17 people had died so that William Hartford and Judge Blackwood could accumulate wealth and power, and Margaret had nearly become the 18th. "Captain Morrison," Dr. Martinez said during a brief pause in his treatment, "this woman has been severely abused for an extended period. The cyanide poisoning is merely the most recent assault on her body. She has multiple healed fractures, extensive scarring, and signs of chronic malnutrition despite living in apparent wealth. Thunder's jaw tightened as the doctor's clinical assessment confirmed what he had suspected. Margaret's suffering had been comprehensive and prolonged, hidden behind the facade of a respectable marriage to one of the county's most prominent citizens. "Will she recover?" he asked quietly. "Physically, yes, with proper care and time. But the emotional healing—" Dr. Martinez shrugged expressively. "That will depend on many factors, including whether she feels safe enough to begin rebuilding her life." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's eyes fluttered open for the first time since losing consciousness. Her gaze was unfocused at first, then sharpened as she recognized Thunder's face leaning over her. "Am I safe?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the trauma her throat had endured. "You're safe," Thunder assured her, though even as he said the words he knew that true safety would require more than physical distance from William Hartford. As long as Hartford and his conspirators remained free, Margaret would never be completely safe anywhere in Texas. Dr. Martinez continued his ministrations while explaining to Margaret what had happened to her and what her recovery would require. The poison had been cleared from her system, but she would need several days of rest and careful monitoring to ensure there were no lasting effects. "What about William?" she asked with a fear that cut Thunder to the bone. Even lying in a medical clinic 20 miles away from her abuser, she was still terrified of his reach and influence. "He's been arrested," Thunder told her, though he knew that arrest and conviction were two very different things in a county where Hartford's money had purchased so much influence. "The evidence against him is overwhelming." But even as he spoke, Thunder was already planning their next moves. He knew that men like Hartford and Blackwood didn't surrender power easily, and that witnesses had a way of disappearing or changing their testimony when sufficient pressure was applied. Margaret's survival meant she could testify against her husband, but it also made her a target for anyone who wanted to prevent that testimony from reaching a courtroom. "I need to get word to Austin," he told Dr. Martinez. "The territorial authorities need to know what's been happening in Redemption Valley. This conspiracy goes too deep for local law enforcement to handle." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "My nephew works for the territorial governor. I will send word immediately that federal investigators are needed." As Margaret drifted back into healing sleep, Thunder stepped outside the clinic to consider their options. The immediate crisis had passed. Margaret was alive and would recover, but the larger battle was just beginning. Hartford and Blackwood had spent years building their network of corruption, and dismantling it would require more than the testimony of one abused woman and the word of an honest cowboy. The sound of approaching horses brought Thunder's attention back to the present. A rider was approaching from the direction of Redemption Valley, pushing his mount hard across the rolling terrain. As the figure drew closer, Thunder recognized Jake Peters, his expression grim with news that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. "Thunder," Jake called as he reined in his lathered horse. "You need to get back to town. Hartford's dead." The words hit Thunder like a physical blow. "What happened?" "Shot himself with that Derringer while Sheriff Coleman was reading the charges. Left a note confessing to everything. All 17 murders, the land theft, even named Judge Blackwood as his partner." Jake paused to catch his breath. "The whole town's in an uproar. Some folks are calling for Blackwood's arrest. Others are saying Hartford was lying to save his own skin." Thunder felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Hartford could never hurt Margaret again, but also frustration that the man's death had eliminated their most important witness against the larger conspiracy. Hartford's confession might implicate Blackwood, but dead men couldn't testify in court, and Blackwood still had powerful allies who would work to discredit any accusations against him. "What about Judge Blackwood?" Thunder asked. "Disappeared. Left town this morning right after Hartford died. Nobody knows where he went, but his house is empty and his safe was cleaned out." The news of Hartford's suicide and Blackwood's flight spread through Redemption Valley like wildfire, transforming the town's atmosphere from tense anticipation to stunned disbelief. Thunder made the decision to return immediately, leaving Margaret in Dr. Martinez's capable care with strict instructions that no one was to know her location except the most trusted allies. The ride back to town gave Thunder time to consider the implications of Hartford's death. While the man's confession provided valuable evidence of the conspiracy's scope, his suicide had also eliminated their primary witness and potentially allowed Blackwood to escape justice. The judge's disappearance suggested he had contingency plans in place for exactly this scenario, which meant the corruption ran even deeper than Thunder had initially suspected. When Thunder arrived in Redemption Valley, he found the town in chaos. Groups of citizens clustered on street corners, their conversations animated with shock, anger, and fear. Some were demanding immediate action against anyone connected to Hartford's schemes, while others seemed paralyzed by the revelation that their trusted leaders had been systematically murdering their neighbors for years. Sheriff Coleman met Thunder outside the Hartford mansion, his face drawn with exhaustion and uncertainty. "Captain Morrison, I'm glad you're back. This situation is bigger than anything I've ever dealt with. Half the town's calling for blood, and the other half is scared they'll be next if they speak up." Thunder dismounted and studied the scene around them. The mansion that had housed so much suffering now stood empty, its expensive furnishings and imported decorations seeming garish and obscene in light of what everyone now knew had transpired within its walls. "What about Hartford's confession?" Thunder asked. "Did he provide enough detail to pursue charges against the other conspirators?" Coleman produced a crumpled sheet of paper, Hartford's final written words. "He named names, all right. Judge Blackwood, Dr. Wright, even some folks in the territorial capital. But without Hartford alive to testify, and with Blackwood vanished, I don't know how much good it'll do in court." Thunder read the confession carefully, noting the meticulous detail with which Hartford had documented his crimes. The man's final act had been to ensure that his legacy would be one of complete exposure, leaving no doubt about the extent of the conspiracy or the identity of his co-conspirators. "Dr. Wright," Thunder observed, "is he still in town?" "Holed up in his office, too scared to show his face. Some of the families whose relatives died under suspicious circumstances have been gathering outside his clinic, demanding answers." Thunder understood their anger, but he also recognized that mob justice would ultimately serve no one's interests. "Sheriff, we need to get Dr. Wright into protective custody before someone decides to take the law into their own hands. He's one of the few living witnesses who can testify about the medical cover-ups." As they discussed logistics, Mrs. Mills approached with a group of townswomen, their faces set with grim determination. "Captain Morrison," she called, "we need to talk about what happens now. Half of us have been complicit in staying silent about things we saw, and the other half are victims ourselves." Thunder recognized the courage it had taken for these women to step forward. For years, they had lived in a community where speaking up about abuse or corruption could result in mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses. Hartford's death had removed the immediate threat, but the fear and shame of their long silence would take time to heal. "Mrs. Mills," Thunder replied, "the most important thing now is ensuring that the truth comes out completely. Every family that lost someone to this conspiracy deserves to know what really happened, and every person who was threatened into silence deserves to be heard." Father O'Brien emerged from the gathered crowd, his cassock dusty from hours spent comforting traumatized parishioners. "Captain, I've been thinking about the confessions Hartford made to me over the years. At the time I thought he was speaking metaphorically about his business dealings, but in light of what we now know—" He shook his head sadly. "I should have recognized the signs. I should have acted. Thunder placed a hand on the priest's shoulder, understanding the burden of guilt that was weighing on everyone who had been in a position to help, but had chosen silence instead. Father, you couldn't have known the full extent of what was happening. The important thing now is that we all commit to ensuring it never happens again. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. A group of riders was approaching from the east, territorial marshals sent from Austin in response to the urgent messages that had been sent after Hartford's arrest. Their arrival meant that the investigation would now have official backing, but it also meant that everyone involved would face federal scrutiny. Marshal James Crawford dismounted and approached Thunder with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to dealing with complex criminal conspiracies. "Captain Morrison, I'm here about the murders and land fraud you reported. We've been watching Judge Blackwood's activities for months, but we needed local witnesses before we could move." Thunder felt a surge of relief at the marshal's words. The federal investigation meant that Blackwood's flight wouldn't necessarily result in his escape from justice, and it also provided protection for witnesses who might otherwise face retaliation from the conspiracy's remaining members. "Marshal Crawford," Thunder replied, "we have extensive documentary evidence, multiple witness testimonies, and a full confession from William Hartford before his suicide. The scope of the conspiracy includes at least 17 murders and systematic theft of property belonging to Mexican-American and immigrant families." Crawford nodded grimly. "We've been tracking similar patterns in 3 other counties. This isn't an isolated case. It's part of a larger network of corruption that extends all the way to the territorial capital." As the marshal began organizing the investigation, Thunder's thoughts turned to Margaret, recovering in Dr. Martinez's clinic. She had survived the immediate attempt on her life, but the long road to healing would require more than medical treatment. She would need a new identity, a new life, and most importantly, the knowledge that she was truly safe from those who had tried to destroy her. The sun was setting over Redemption Valley as Thunder prepared to return to San Felipe. The town would never be the same after what had been revealed, but perhaps that was for the best. Sometimes, he reflected, the only way to build something good was to first tear down everything that was rotten. For the first time in years, Thunder Morrison allowed himself to hope that justice might actually prevail. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stand by when someone needs you to speak up for them. In a world that often rewards silence over courage, we must remember that our voices and our actions can literally save lives. Think about the Margaret Hartfords in your own community, the neighbors whose bruises they explain away, the friends who seem to shrink whenever their spouses are mentioned, the elderly relatives whose accidents seem suspiciously frequent. Like Thunder Morrison, we all have moments when we can choose between comfortable silence and uncomfortable truth. The difference between these choices isn't just personal. It ripples through entire communities, sometimes for generations. True love isn't just about finding someone to cherish. It's about being someone brave enough to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. What moment in your own life do you wish you had found the courage to speak up for someone who couldn't speak for themselves? Have you ever been the Margaret in this story, waiting and hoping that someone would finally see your pain and choose to act?